Welcome back to episode 3 of Reading for Fun, and I'm excited to be doing a spoiler free and a spoiler review of Red Rising by Pierce Brown. Now, this is the collector's edition of Red Rising. It is not the physical copy that I read when I first read this book. That one's being lent out to a friend right now. But with me having a special edition, you can probably get an understanding of how I felt about this book. So let's go ahead and dive into it. My spoiler-free review is going to be pretty short. I'm going to spend more time on spoilers just because at this point it's such a popular book. If you haven't read it by now, you're going to hear from just about everybody that you should read it. Now, that being said, there are a couple things that I want to point out. The first thing I would like to point out is when I first read this book, I read the physical copy. When I actually went back to reread it for this video, I did the full cast audible of this series, and I highly, if you can, recommend to get an audible account and do the full cast version of this book. It is absolutely incredible. The voice actors are amazing, and it took what was already an amazing book to the next level. So that's the first tip. If you can, do the audible version of this book. You will not be disappointed. Second thing I want to point out is the good thing about recommending this book is you're going to know very quickly whether or not it is something that you're going to want to read. You know, I mentioned in my first episode of this series with The Name of the Wind that the pacing was a little bit slow to start off the book, and after about 80 pages or so, I was finally able to get into it. Pierce Brown, he has a relentless pace. You know, from start to finish, it is non-stop action, and because of that, you're going to know pretty early on if it's a book for you. So, with that being said, pick it up, read 10, 15, 20 pages. By the end of that 10, 15, 20 pages, you're either going to want to continue to read or you can go ahead and stop. You know, last thing I would mention is it is a brutal book. There's a lot of like sexual violence and stuff throughout the book. So, if that's something that you tend to avoid in your reading, I would recommend not reading it because that's just the reality of the series. In fact, what actually got me to initially read this book was when I was reading The Name of the Wind and Wise Man's Fear. I started, dabbling into booktube for the first time. And I forgot which video it was, but the person doing the video actually mentioned that, if Hunger Games was like cable television, Red Rising is like the HBO Max version of that. So it kind of put it into, it put a good picture into like what to expect. And it intrigued me enough to pick it up. So just expect it to be brutal, but expect amazing writing and an amazing story and falling in love with the characters. So with that being said, that's a quick spoiler free. Now I want to dive into spoilers. So if you haven't read this book, stop the video now, go read it, and come back. If even one person in the comment section let me know that they read this book because of this video, it'd be worth it because I would say out of every single book that I've read to this point, this is the book I've recommended to the most friends and family. It's absolutely amazing. So, with that being said, it's time for spoilers. Now, I want to do the spoilers for when I read this book, right? So, at the time, it was the third book I had ever read for fun. You know, the difference between the King Killer Chronicles and Red Rising is night and day. So it was a bit of a whirlwind, but it was a journey that I didn't know if I was ready for, but I had a blast throughout. And I actually kind of want to start off, usually you would start off with the main protagonist. I want to start off with the side characters with this book because that was the biggest difference for me is, the side characters in The Name of the Wind, are kind of just there just to tell more of Kavoth's story versus the side characters with Darrow and Red Rising made a huge impact on how good the book was, in my opinion. Starting off with, the first page, you hear about how he loses his father. Not far after that, he loses his wife, Io, who ends up being, extremely important for the entire book. And then, you go from that to meeting the Sons of Ares, uh, meeting Mickey, the carver. That whole section of the book I absolutely loved. Kind of hearing the perspective of the carver treating Darrow more like a piece of art than an actual human, and how Darrow was so distraught and confused about everything, and to this point his entire life had been a lie, that he was so focused on trying to figure all that out that in the meantime he's just going through being transformed into a gold. So absolutely loved the short time that we had with Mickey in this book, and that just set us up, for the games. And obviously, when you find out that he's gonna have to get through Julian to get into the games, and you know who Julian is, and you know that Cassius is gonna want to kill whoever ended up killing Julian, and then of course he becomes close with Cassius, and they become brothers for the first part of the book, and the entire time there's like a ticking time bomb of eventually Cassius is going to find out that it was Darrow. You just don't know how or when. And so while you're reading the book, you have that in the back of your mind throughout. Um, you hear about the jackal and how scary and intimidating, and how Darrow straight up admits that he's scared of the jackal and everything about him. But again, you hear about him more towards the middle of the book, and eventually there's going to be a meetup with the jackal. You just don't know when or how. And so you're thinking about that while you're reading. Uh, the way he ignores Mustang, that doesn't call her out when he sees her, and then she returns the favor by essentially saving his life. Severo giving some comedic parts throughout the book, which was awesome. I would be honest and say that I feel like a lot of other people, Severo was one of my favorite characters, both him and Pax. Pax is like a gentle giant throughout the book when he finally decides to work with Darrow, and he kind of, I feel like everyone at some point in life had like somebody at school or something who was bigger than everybody else, but they had like the biggest heart, and that's how Pax was. And then of course he ends up getting taken away from us in a situation where while you're reading it, you're just completely blown away because you know that it can be avoided, but it wasn't, and you have to deal with the consequences of that. There's a lot more side characters, and I feel like that's kind of the point, and that's why I wanted to start off with it. Because in a book that has such a strong protagonist, the fact that there are so many side characters that you love or hate, and for different reasons, is one reason why I felt this book was just so strong. Another thing that I liked is kind of the different steps in the journey, right? So you start off with a book with Darrow being, a hell diver, and him making it very clear that he would have been happy to just be a hell diver for the rest of his life, or as long as he could have done it, be with his family, be with his wife, have some kids, and that would be enough. But instead, his wife has a bigger dream, and it pushes his life into something that he never could have expected. And then of course he goes to the city for the first time, and everything that he was told his whole life was a lie, and he has such a short amount of time to deal with that and to process that, because yes, everything is a lie, but now he's also been chosen to do something about it. So then he goes and hangs out with Mickey, turns into a gold, becomes an absolute unit, and then is sent to the games. And the rest of the book is spent in the games, and it's a pretty broad, I correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like a little bit over a year that they spend in the games. So even though it doesn't feel like a giant world at the time, you can see a lot of growth throughout the time you spent in the games. One thing that is I've seen throughout different YouTube videos is people talking about how it's kind of like it's a YA book because Darrow is only 16. I mean, I guess, but really that's the only YA thing about this book, right? Outside of Darrow being 16 and in the games as a kid, it's a dystopian sci-fi fantasy all wrapped into one amazing book. And I just really liked how there were different stages, but it was all very clear and distinct, and you got to enjoy each part individually. Um, and I know I'm kind of just rambling on here. I just finished listening to it after reading it a few years back when it was only the third book I read at the time, and I decided, what, I want to just get on here and in one take, just get the most raw, spoilers I can about this book because I like it when other people do that. So I wanted to give it a try. So that's what I'm doing here. But what I want to talk about next is, I love the class system, especially for this first book with Red Rising. You understand that there's a ton of politics and there's a ton of class disparities that are going to be throughout the series, but you're not hit with it really heavy in this first book. I think Pierce Brown does an amazing job at explaining the different classes and how they work. And you understand that those classes are there for a reason, and there's a lot of politics that are involved in it. But he's not like, it's not overbearing. He's not hitting you over the head with it. It's just a good, clear understanding, and then from that point on, you're with Darrow. So I love that. I love that part of it. And then I think, one of my favorite parts, now going into talking about Darrow, the main protagonist, is I loved how you got to watch him grow as a leader throughout his time in the games, while also seeing what he was thinking while doing it. So, there's multiple times in the book where he's thinking one thing and then he has a different action. And because you're in his point of view, you actually get to see that whole entire process. And I really enjoyed that part of this book. Another thing that I liked was just little nuggets here and there, things that didn't seem big, but were just fun things to be revealed. Whether it was Fitchner being Severo's dad, or the Jackal and Mustang being twins, right? I thought that was awesome. And then, like I said earlier, I liked how many times that there was something that you knew, even as an early reader, was going to happen, and you just didn't know when or how. And so it kind of made you uneasy the whole time you were reading the book, but an uneasy in a good way, if that makes sense. Um, Now, this is one part where I know I watched the video, I think it was by Daniel Green, and he said that one of his problems with the first book in this, trilogy was that the ending was really obvious. And if you were, you know, a reader with anything but rocks in between your ears, you would understand how this book was going to end. And apparently, maybe I was just an early reader, but the ending was not what I expected at all. I loved the ending, them taking over what Mount Olympus, and the way that it happened. I was not expecting that at all. And then the book ends in a perfect way where you immediately want to pick up book number two. I've heard people say that Red Rising is kind of like a standalone, in the sense that everything that happened in Red Rising needed to happen the way it did, but then the series just takes off afterwards. And if that's the case, when you read Red Rising for the first time, that's awesome, because if it was a standalone, it'd be an incredible standalone. But with that being said, it ends in a way where you're really excited to pick up book number two, which to me, that's got to be a hard thing to do as a writer. And Pierce Brown did it amazing. So, I mean, kind of bounced around a lot there. I don't have a lot of complaints about the book, specifically if I'm thinking about where I was when I first read it. There's just not a lot of complaints. Really, the only thing, if I'm trying to, not just say 5 stars out of five, it's perfect. One thing that I wish, or I didn't love how it worked, was when Cassius did, stab Darrow in the chest. When I was reading that in my head, I'm like, there's no way that Cassius wouldn't have made sure that Darrow was dead when he did that, right? I mean, we just earlier watched him absolutely brutalize Titus, and Darrow allowed him to do that, and then now he gets the chance to do the same thing to the person that he knows for a fact killed his brother, and all he does is stab him in the chest. I I didn't really see that being realistic based off of what we know about Cassius. And then we're kind of confirmed that at the end, right? Where, excuse me, towards the end of the book, when Darrow sees Cassius again, and he's almost like, "Hey, I know you stabbed me in the chest. Like, all's forgiven. Let's be boys." And Cassius spits in his face and says, "If we ever meet again, you know, one of us is going to survive. The other one's going to hell." So, all that to be said, Cassius had a chance to kill Darrow. He would have killed Darrow. That's probably my biggest complaint. That's about it. Um, would I recommend this book? 100%. It's complete 5 star out of 5 star for me. Going from Patrick Rothfuss to Pierce Brown was, night and day. But if the name of the wind is what got me excited to read again, Pierce Brown is what took that to level 10. So that will do it for episode 3 of Reading for Fun. And now I get to put this beautiful book onto the bookshelf. We've got 3 books in and a lot more to go. So I'm so excited for next week to talk about book number 4. Until then, read for fun, and I'll see you guys then.